Content warning. This episode discusses the murder and sexual assault of a child. Listener discretion is strongly advised. 4 nights before Christmas, 1982, in the quiet inner Melbourne suburb of Northcote, a mother walks into her 6-year-old daughter's bedroom to check on her before turning in for the night. The kind of small, automatic gesture almost every parent makes without a second thought. Except this time, she finds her daughter lying in a pool of blood. The little girl's name is Bonnie Clarke. She has been raped, strangled, and stabbed in her own bed, inside her own home, sometime in the hours everyone else in that house was asleep. There is no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. The family dog, usually alert to the smallest disturbance, never barked. To the detective who takes charge of the investigation, those 2 details point in only one direction, towards somebody already inside that house that night. And the person he decides is responsible isn't a stranger, isn't an intruder, isn't anyone from outside the family at all. It's Bonnie's mother. For the better part of the next 20 years, Marion Wishart will live under a cloud that never fully lifts. The woman half of Melbourne quietly believes got away with murdering her own daughter, despite never once being charged, despite never being able to produce a single piece of physical evidence tying her to the crime. Meanwhile, the man who actually did it will go on, in plain sight, to commit at least one more act of horrific violence, serve time for it, walk free again, and settle into a quiet, ordinary-looking new life working at a heritage steam railway in the Dandenong Ranges, never once suspecting that the detail that will eventually unravel everything has been sitting, untouched, in a police file for 2 decades. This is the story of Bonnie Clarke. It's a story about how easily an investigation can fix its gaze on the wrong person, and about the extraordinary lengths it eventually took to fix that mistake and get the right one. Part 1. The Clarke family in 1982. Northcote was a working-class inner suburb of Melbourne, leafy in parts, unglamorous in others. The kind of neighbourhood full of modest weatherboard homes and families getting on with ordinary life. Denise Clarke and Marion Wishart lived there with their 6-year-old daughter, Bonnie, a bright, cheerful little girl by every account of those who knew her, the kind of child a household organises itself entirely around. Like a lot of families at the time, money was tight enough that the Clarkes took in a boarder to help cover the bills, a fairly common, unremarkable arrangement in that era, particularly in a suburb like Northcote. The young man who came to stay with them was in his late 20s, working locally at a cinema. His name was Malcolm Clarke, no relation to the family despite sharing their surname, simply a coincidence of naming that would go on to cause no shortage of confusion in the years that followed. By most accounts, nothing about Malcolm's presence in the household raised any particular alarm at the time. He was just the boarder, a young man renting a room, working his shifts, coming and going. If there were any early warning signs about the way he behaved around 6-year-old Bonnie, they weren't the kind of signs anyone in 1982 was necessarily equipped to recognize, let alone act on. On the night of the 21st of December, 1982, with Christmas just days away, and the household no doubt full of the small, ordinary excitement that comes with it, Bonnie went to bed as she did most nights. Nobody in that house had any reason to think it would be the last time she did. Part 2. The night sometime in the hours after the household went to sleep, somebody entered Bonnie's bedroom. She was sexually assaulted. She was strangled. She was stabbed. Whoever did it made some attempt afterward to clean up what they'd done. Bonnie's body had been clumsily washed, and her pajamas were later found stuffed down between the bed frame and the wall, as though whoever was responsible had tried, in a panicked, incomplete way, to erase some of the evidence of what had just happened. When Marion went in to check on her daughter, she found her exactly where she'd left her hours earlier, except now lying in a pool of blood, dead. Police arrived quickly, and from very early on in the investigation, two details anchored their entire theory of the case. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house, and the family dog, which would ordinarily have reacted to any intruder, hadn't made a sound all night. To the lead detective on the case, a man named Eric Lilly, those two facts pointed toward an unavoidable, if devastating, conclusion that whoever had killed Bonnie hadn't broken in from outside. They'd already been inside the house. And in a household with a mother, a father, and a boarder, the person Detective Lilly decided to focus his suspicion on was Marion. Part 3. A mother under suspicion. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with just how thin the actual case against Marion Wishart was, because it never really amounted to more than those two circumstantial details. No forced entry, a dog that didn't bark, layered on top of the simple, grim statistical fact that in cases of violence against children, family members are statistically more likely suspects than strangers. There was no physical evidence connecting Marion to her daughter's murder. No confession, no motive investigators could coherently articulate. Nothing beyond a working theory that, once formed, seems to have shaped almost everything about how the initial investigation proceeded. Years later, reflecting on the case, Ron Idles, the veteran homicide detective who would eventually be the one to finally solve it, put it about as plainly as it can be put. He said he could never quite work out how the original investigators arrived at Marion as their prime suspect, beyond those two details and seemingly very little else. But suspicion, once it's publicly attached to someone, doesn't require proof to do damage. Marion Wishart was never charged with any crime in connection with her daughter's death. And yet for the better part of 2 decades, she lived as a woman many people in her own community quietly believed had gotten away with killing her own 6-year-old daughter. A reputation she had absolutely no way to disprove, because there was no trial, no formal accusation she could actually defend herself against in court. Just a lingering, unspoken cloud that followed her through a small community for 20 years, while the investigation into who had actually killed Bonnie slowly, quietly stalled out completely. Somewhere in the middle of all this, almost as an afterthought, police did briefly turn their attention to the family's boarder. In 1983, less than a year after Bonnie's murder, Malcolm Clarke was arrested and charged in connection with an entirely separate crime, an aggravated rape. While he was in custody for that offense, detectives investigating Bonnie's murder took the opportunity to ask him a few questions about her death. He denied any involvement, and that, extraordinarily, was essentially the end of it. Nobody checked his alibi. Nobody looked deeper into his history. He was, at that point, already a man with a documented history of extreme sexual violence sitting right there in a police file connected to the case, and the investigation simply moved on, its attention still fixed on Bonnie's mother. Part 4. The man nobody looked at closely enough, what investigators didn't fully appreciate at the time, and what would only come to light through painstaking work decades later, was just how violent Malcolm Clarke's history actually was. In 1980, 2 years before Bonnie's murder, Malcolm Clarke had killed a 22-year-old woman named Teresa Crow. He was eventually convicted in connection with her death on charges of rape and manslaughter in 1984, roughly a year and a half after Bonnie was murdered, and around the same period he'd briefly been questioned and cleared with essentially no scrutiny about her death. He served a sentence for the Crow case and was released from prison in 1995. By the time detectives would eventually catch up to him again, nearly 2 decades after Bonnie's murder, Malcolm Clarke had rebuilt an entirely ordinary-looking life. He was working at Puffing Billy, the historic steam railway that runs through the Dandenong Ranges outside Melbourne, a beloved local tourist attraction, exactly the kind of wholesome, public-facing job that would have raised no alarm bells whatsoever for anyone who didn't already know what he'd done. For 20 years, that was where the case sat, an innocent woman carrying the unofficial, unprovable suspicion of her own community, and the actual killer working, quite comfortably, in plain view. Part 5. A dying man's request. What finally reopened Bonnie's case wasn't new forensic technology, and it wasn't a fresh tip that fell into police laps out of nowhere. It was Bonnie's father, Dennis Clarke, and the fact that he was dying. In 2001, with his own health failing, Dennis reached out directly to Ron Idles. By that point, already a well-regarded homicide detective within Victoria Police, a man who had built a reputation for exactly this kind of painstaking, patient, cold casework. Dennis's request was simple and devastating in its simplicity. He wanted to see his daughter's murder solved before he died. Idles took on the case, working alongside a colleague, Detective Tim Day, and their first move was one that sounds almost deceptively basic. They went back through the entire original case file, page by page, operating on the guiding principle Idles would become known for throughout his career, that in a huge number of cold cases, the answer isn't hiding somewhere new. It's sitting somewhere in the original file, unrecognized or underinvestigated the first time around. That approach paid off almost immediately. Digging back through the file, detectives found the name of the family's old boarder, Malcolm Clarke. And around the same time, a childhood friend of Bonnie's named Kylie Ward came forward with something she'd apparently been carrying since childhood. A memory of Malcolm behaving inappropriately around Bonnie during the period he'd lived with the family. The kind of detail nobody had thought, in 1982 or 1983, to specifically ask a 6-year-old's friends about. Detectives also went back and found something that had been sitting in the file the entire time, unexamined. A card Malcolm Clarke had at some point sent to Bonnie. It's a small, almost mundane piece of evidence on its own. A card from a family boarder to a young child in the household he was staying in. But combined with everything else now surfacing about Malcolm, it took on a very different weight. And then came the detail that turned a resurfaced name into an active suspect. Malcolm's 1982 alibi for the night of Bonnie's murder had been that he was working his shift at the cinema. Nobody had ever actually checked the claim at the time. When Detective Day tracked down the cinema's shift records from the 21st of December, 1982, they showed, unambiguously, that Malcolm Clarke had not worked that night at all. 20 years after the fact, investigators finally had what they needed to treat Malcolm Clarke as their prime suspect. What they still didn't have was anything close to enough hard evidence to charge him. Part 6. The sting to get that evidence, Victoria Police turned to a controversial and elaborate investigative technique known internationally as the Mr. Big operation, sometimes called the Canadian model, because it was first developed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the 1960s, before spreading to law enforcement agencies in a handful of other countries, Australia among them. The premise of a Mr. Big operation is, in essence, an extended piece of theatre. Undercover officers approach a suspect and slowly, over weeks or months, draw them into what appears to be a lucrative criminal organization, offering friendship, money, status, a sense of belonging to something bigger and more exciting than the suspect's ordinary life. Once the suspect is invested in that fictional world and eager to prove themselves worthy of full membership, the operation builds toward a final test, a meeting with the organization's boss, Mr. Big himself, who explains that in order to be fully trusted, to be protected from any legal consequences the gang's resources could supposedly make disappear, the suspect needs to come clean about anything in their past that could pose a risk, including, if it applies, an unsolved murder. It's a technique that's proven remarkably effective at extracting confessions from people who might never have said a word to a real police detective. But it's also drawn serious criticism internationally, precisely because it works by manufacturing a set of incentives designed to make confessing feel like the safest, most rewarding option available, rather than something offered freely. Over the following months, undercover officers built exactly that kind of relationship with Malcolm Clarke, drawing him gradually into a fabricated criminal enterprise. Believing he was finally being welcomed into serious organized crime, and hoping to prove himself trustworthy enough for full membership, Clarke ultimately sat down in a hotel room with an undercover officer he knew simply as Phil, and confessed to murdering Bonnie Clarke. On the 6th of June, 2002, with that confession secured, detectives Ron Idles and Tim Day were waiting at the rear of Victoria Police Headquarters on St Kilda Road when Malcolm Clarke arrived, having been led there under the pretense of the operation continuing. He was arrested and charged with Bonnie's murder. Part 7. The trial by the time Malcolm Clarke's case reached Victoria's Supreme Court roughly 2 years later, he had reversed course entirely, pleading not guilty and disavowing the confession he'd given in that hotel room. His defense argued that the confession was worthless, that Clarke had only said what he did because he genuinely believed it was the price of admission into the criminal organization he thought he was being recruited into, and that he continued playing along even once he was formally arrested and interviewed at police headquarters, believing, according to his lawyers, that the officers involved were simply corrupt cops on the gang's payroll rather than genuine investigators building a ring. It's a defense that gets to the heart of why Mr. Big operations remain so contested as an investigative tool. If a confession is elicited through an elaborate fiction built specifically to make confessing feel advantageous, how much weight should a jury actually put on it? The prosecution's case leaned not just on the confession itself, but on the surrounding evidence that had brought detectives to Clarke in the first place. His false alibi, his documented history of extreme sexual violence against Teresa Crow, the card he'd sent to Bonnie, and the account from Bonnie's childhood friend, Kylie Ward, about his behavior around her. On Thursday, the 17th of June, 2004, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Malcolm Clarke was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 25 years before he would be eligible for parole. According to accounts from the courtroom, as the sentence was read out, Clarke turned to look back at the public gallery. Part 8. What it cost the conviction finally did two things at once, more than 2 decades after Bonnie's murder. It brought a measure of justice, belated, imperfect, but real, for a 6-year-old girl whose killer had spent 20 years living freely, working an ordinary job at a beloved local tourist railway, having already been questioned and dismissed as a suspect once before. And it finally, definitively cleared Marion Wishart's name. But finally cleared doesn't undo the preceding 20 years. Marion had spent 2 decades under a form of suspicion she was never formally charged with, and therefore never given any real, official opportunity to disprove, carrying, in a small community, a reputation as the mother who'd supposedly gotten away with murdering her own child, based on nothing more than an investigator's early hunch about a dog that hadn't barked and a door that hadn't been forced. That's not a wrong that a guilty verdict against the real killer, arriving 22 years later, can fully repair. Denise Clarke, whose dying request had set the entire reinvestigation in motion, lived to see the case reopened and Malcolm Clarke arrested. A small mercy, in a story that offers very few of them. There's a particular kind of failure embedded in this case that goes beyond the 20 years it took to catch Bonnie Clarke's killer, because for a significant portion of that time, police weren't simply failing to solve the case. They were actively looking in the wrong direction, at the one person in that household who was actually innocent, while the man responsible sat in the file the whole time, questioned once, dismissed almost instantly, and left free to go on living his life for another 2 decades. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in cases where snap judgments, formed early and under pressure, end up calcifying into an entire investigation's guiding theory. A theory that then becomes very hard to dislodge, even when it's wrong, even when the actual evidence never really supported it in the first place. Marion Wishart, lived the consequences of that kind of premature certainty for 20 years. Bonnie never got the chance to grow up at all. What finally broke the case open wasn't new science, or a lucky break, or an anonymous tip landing out of nowhere. It was a dying father who refused to let his daughter's murder stay buried in an old file. Two detectives willing to go back through decades-old paperwork with fresh eyes, and the simple, unglamorous discovery that nobody had ever actually checked whether the family's boarder had really been at work the night Bonnie died. Bonnie Clarke was 6 years old. She should have grown up in that quiet Northcote Street, gone through school, built an entire life that this case will never get to tell us anything about. Instead, her name is now permanently attached to one of the more troubling reminders in Australian criminal history of how badly an investigation can go wrong when it settles on an answer too early, and how long the truth can sit quietly in a file, waiting for someone to finally go back and look again. This has been the case of Bonnie Clarke. Thank you for listening.